Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special preview of the 2016 NFL Draft, which is scheduled to start this Thursday in Chicago. I'm Tom Moore from VikeFans.com, and for the third consecutive year, I'm pleased to welcome back our resident draft expert, Jeff Nichols. Jeff, it's got to be an exciting time of year for a personnel and talent-focused guy like you.
It definitely is, Tom. Thanks for having me back. I mean, once the draft rolls around, everything kind of gets busy. It's the last hurrah before we hit training camp in the regular season, I guess, already.
Yeah, fans are always excited because people try to figure out what's the phenomenon of the draft. How come it gets ratings like a World Series game? And for me, it just comes down to the fact of every team's undefeated at this point in time, so everybody's got optimism.
Definitely, no. Everyone has a sense of hope. Everyone wants to see how their roster is going to improve for the upcoming season. And I mean, it's been a little while since the Super Bowl. I mean, people are just looking to kind of fill their football itch. So the draft kind of does that in the process leading up to it as well.
Absolutely. Well, I'll tell you what we're doing. We're going to dive into this thing. And what we want to do is we want to encourage our listeners here. This can be posted on several sites to interact with Jeff. He'll respond to your questions and clarifications you're looking for, so you're really set for the draft. And Jeff, where I want to start is, obviously we're Viking centric. So let's turn our attention to the Minnesota draft. And I'd like to start with the current team that's on the roster right now today before the draft. And when we talked this time a couple years ago, we were discussing which quarterback the Vikings should take in the first round. Was it going to be Blake Bortles or Derek Carr or Teddy Bridgewater or even Johnny Manziel? And you were always a proponent of Bridgewater as the pick, and that's who Rick Spielman selected as well. As you look at Bridgewater now, as he's about to enter his third season, would you still make that same pick? And what does he need to do to finally dispel the critics and be that entrenched franchise quarterback the Vikings are looking for?
I mean, I'll live and die by Teddy Bridgewater. I mean, he was my pick back before the draft, and he'll still be my pick now. I think Teddy Bridgewater is a great mesh with the Vikings especially, and I think that was something I felt out pre-draft, of kind of the vision the Vikings had of how they wanted to build their roster. And I mean, with Adrian Peterson kind of being the focal point of the offense the past few years, Teddy Bridgewater was the quarterback where you wouldn't have to go with a completely pass-centric offense in order to kind of bring him along. I think this year, eventually, or I mean, in the coming year and a half or so, the Vikings are really going to start leaning more heavily on Teddy Bridgewater. At this point, he's really entrenched himself as more of a leader on the offense, which I think is really step number one for a quarterback. Whenever you have wide receivers, tight ends, and the offensive line believing that you can be that franchise guy that can lead you to victories, I mean, it will go a long way in motivating people and really upgrading his play as well. As we move into this season, I think what really has to happen is Teddy has to become a little more aggressive. I think that at this point to his career, I wouldn't call him a game manager per se, but he's been more of a coach-pleasing quarterback. He isn't willing to make that risky throw that potentially will turn the ball over, I mean, at the 40, 30-yard line. With the potential, I mean, to put the defense back on the field, which is that's fine and that's all well. But I think it also led to a lot of our red zone deficiencies this past year as well. So with Teddy becoming more aggressive, I think he'll be willing to uncork his arm a little bit in the middle of the field. I mean, that doesn't include the deep ball per se. I mean, the deep ball will improve over time, but I think it will go a long way in upgrading the Vikings' red zone offense just naturally without adding much talent to the roster as it stands now.
You mentioned Teddy taking some chances. When you look at him in games the last couple of years, is he maybe holding on to the ball too long to wait for his receivers to be open instead of throwing them open?
Part of the problem at times. I mean, in this past season, with the way the offensive line was developed, I mean, any quarterback's going to start getting the jitters after we're being hit so many times game after game. There were times Mike Wallace was running open down the field and Teddy wasn't willing to uncork it because he had a check down open underneath, which, I mean, that goes back to more of the coach-pleasing aspect of what he's trying to do and not willing to make a big mistake. But I think at times Teddy really could uncork the ball, and when it comes to his throwing motion, I mean, most quarterbacks really should be going over the top since it gives them more control over how the ball kind of comes down the trajectory level instead of more of Teddy's sidearm approach, which I mean, it's worked for him in the past. And I mean, you don't want to change something that works and has worked for him. But I mean, this is just my personal observation. I mean, a quarterback coach could tell you otherwise. But when you have that sidearm release, it makes it a lot easier to fling the ball down the field, which causes it to float and can lead to some overthrows. So I think that plagued him a little bit. But once you have a wide receiver on the outside who builds some chemistry with Teddy, almost like he had it in Louisville with Devontae Parker, I mean, he has shown the willingness to throw the ball into contested windows there. So I don't foresee that being a major problem moving forward.
Okay, hey Jeff, I'm going to stay with the quarterback position as we head into this draft. And Bridgewater right now is backed up by Shaun Hill. But to me, in his limited playing time last year, Hill looks pretty immobile at this point and inaccurate beyond 10 yards. Is he the right guy for the backup position right now, or would you look for an upgrade in the draft or even the remainder of free agency?
I think that's a situation that kind of remains a bit open-ended. I think initially Shaun Hill was brought in to be more of a mentor to Teddy, and I think that was important at the time, as Teddy was still becoming more entrenched as a leader on the team. And moving forward, I don't think that aspect of Shaun Hill's role is going to be as important, and then it really comes down to who's going to be the best backup and who can play, and if the need were to arise. To be honest, I don't know if Shaun Hill's that option. I mean, the nice thing about Shaun Hill's contract as it stands now is that there's no guaranteed money left on his deal, so he could be cut outright during training camp and wouldn't leave any remains on the Vikings salary cap. But that really leaves it open to maybe a potential draft pick, an undrafted free agent type pickup. But I really think a good look will be given to Taylor Heineke this training camp and during OTAs as well. I mean, he performed quite well during the preseason last year, and he did enough for the Vikings to keep him on the roster throughout the season. So I don't think they would be willing to carry that weight unless they saw something in him that made them believe he could potentially be the backup quarterback moving forward. But no, I don't foresee the Vikings spending a middle round pick on a backup quarterback unless someone tremendous who they thought highly of fell.
Well, if Teddy's to evolve into that franchise quarterback the Vikings have long since seemingly Fran Tarkenton, he's got to have some targets to throw to, and I think the Viking fan base is going to have a coronary if Rick Spielman doesn't draft a wideout pretty high in this year's draft. And I'm hearing a lot of intriguing names at the position, people like Laquan Treadwell, Corey Coleman, Josh Dachshund, and maybe even Will Fuller. Given the choice that we have at number 23 in round one, who is still there that you think fits the Minnesota offense best?
I think it's hard to say who will be there. I mean, in this year's draft, there's a lot of defensive talent, and that depth on the defensive side of the ball ranges pretty far down the draft board. Historically, at times, that's pushed some of the skilled players higher on the draft boards as the talent pool kind of drops off a bit sooner, and that forces teams' hands a little bit to make sure that they're going to fill the position that they need a bit sooner. So I think that's still yet to be seen how the draft board will unfold on draft day. But when it comes down to the number 23 spot, the guy that I've had my eye on that fits the Viking system probably the best is Josh Dachshund out of TCU. He's the type of receiver that you can play at split end. Although he's had some trouble with press at TCU, he has that long, lengthy frame and the arm extension to develop good moves to get off the press at the line of scrimmage. And, I mean, as most fans know, he's great at tracking the ball in the air and will come down with a lot of contested catches down the field. So when it comes from a comfort standpoint, if you're looking for a receiver that you can potentially throw the ball up to in more of a contested catch situation, he's the guy that Teddy could build some trust with. Other receivers at number 23 that I feel the Vikings would consider would be the other two would be Laquan Treadwell or Corey Coleman. Laquan Treadwell is kind of an interesting case, and I mean, I think he's going to be an interesting case study to look back in a few years on, as he possesses a lot of the traits you look for in a wide receiver, but lacks the true speed aspect that has kind of dominated the modern day NFL scene. So while he may fall to number 23, or a team could look past that earlier, I think he'll be highly considered at the spot. But to kind of switch gears a little bit, I think the other player the Vikings could consider would be Corey Coleman. Although he kind of looks like the speed demon that people may see in Mike Wallace, he's a completely different player. He's the type of player who has game-breaking speed, although he didn't run a full route tree at Baylor. And has struggled in the run game as well, as Baylor doesn't expect their wide receivers to block or come back to the ball as often as one might like to see. He shows a lot of the intangible aspects for the wide receiver position that would really make teams consider him probably in the 20s or even early in the second round if he were to fall.
You mentioned Josh Dachshund, but, the casual fan doesn't really understand the difference in a good receiver and perhaps an elite receiver. What does Dachshund do that would be an upgrade to what fans would have seen with Mike Wallace last year?
Sure. They're completely different receivers, but the nice thing about Josh Dachshund is he's a nice complement to Stephon Diggs, who will be playing on the opposite side of the field at more of a flanker position. And he also complements Jarius Wright in the slot as well. The thing with Mike Wallace is not that he was only a one-trick pony, that he would run down the field, and when he gained separation, he'd be open. He wasn't the type of guy you'd throw the ball into a contested catch situation, which really limited the offense in the red zone. Mike Wallace was the type of player where you're going to blow the top off the defense once, or at least that was what the hope was. And that's where he would kind of prove to be worthy of his roster spot. That didn't really happen for a multitude of reasons. It wasn't just Wallace. It wasn't just Bridgewater. But Dachshund brings another aspect to the game where he can run slants underneath while still having the strength to break a tackle and run in the open field. Although he's not a game breaker speed-wise, he will run away from defensive backs, and once he's in the open field, he isn't often caught. But the nice thing about Dachshund in the red zone is he's someone you can run into the back of the end zone on a fade. He can come down with those types of balls consistently, but you can also pressure defensive backs who come up on him and release to the inside and pressure them on the slant. So he's a much tougher guard, I guess, for defensive backs in the red zone. And I think if you look at the Vikings offense as a whole, if they could switch some field goals into touchdowns, the offense would look much better.
A year ago, the Vikings drafted Michael Pruitt to give the Vikings probably some more punch in the tight end passing options. But fans have been waiting and waiting for Kyle Rudolph to show that Pro Bowl form that we glimpsed his rookie year. If you were looking at Rudolph based on his time with Minnesota, let's see, he was coming out in the draft this year, based on the tape you've seen him as a Viking so far, there's always this talk about the breakout season. We see injuries, and he hasn't really found that connection with Bridgewater. How do you actually evaluate him? Is Kyle Rudolph really that Pro Bowl level athlete, or is his window passed?
I don't believe his window is passed, but I think it's yet to be seen if he can be a consistent Pro Bowl talent. I think last year he didn't get the benefit of the doubt due to how the offensive line performed. Often the Vikings had to bring a tight end in to kind of chip on the line of scrimmage and prevent the pass rush of the opposing team from just completely breaking the floodgates open. So I think that caused some issues. In addition to that, Mike Wallace not being able to pull safeties down the field consistently and Teddy being able to connect on those throws allowed the defense to really sit in the box, and that's where Kyle Rudolph really makes his bones in the NFL, is when he can get open underneath. I think the one positive thing for Kyle Rudolph that he showed last season is that he's capable of running down the seam and gaining separation. That's the one aspect of the game I think the Vikings will truly want to try to exploit this season. If you look at Teddy's splits, he's much more accurate throwing down the seam and inside the hashes, and that's something that if the Vikings can find a way that the offensive line can hold up and they can run Rudolph down the field, I think he'll find a lot of success doing that. Other than that, I mean, he runs good stick routes and he can get to the sideline well, and he makes contested catches. So while I don't think he'll be the tight end who many people believed he could be after he made the Pro Bowl in his rookie season, I believe, I do believe he can be an above average tight end in the league.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned Teddy Bridgewater was running for his life last year behind an offensive line that really struggled mightily against the pass blocking and the pass blocking schemes. And after that position's been largely ignored for years in free agency and the draft, Minnesota finally made a splash this offseason by signing mammoth Alex Boone from the 49ers. Now, he's supposed to be a pretty stellar pass blocker, but what I'm wondering is, by adding just one new starter to the mix in this line, is that really going to be enough? And more importantly, are the injury-prone John Sullivan and Phil Lodeholt returning really going to make this a solid line overall?
Kind of the theme of the interview is that it's yet to be seen a bit. I think the nice thing about Boone is he's a plug-in left guard. I think the left guard spot has always been a question mark for the Vikings year over year. Last year they plugged Fusco into left guard, and I mean the results were not as hoped. So I think the Vikings will most likely move him back to the right side of the offensive line. But as for Phil Loadholt and John Sullivan, I think it's kind of a wait-and-see approach. I mean, many people are more worried about John Sullivan's back than Phil Loadholt's Achilles. Mm-hmm. But I really think it should be the other way around. There's been other centers who's had similar back injuries and surgeries and have come back to have much success in the NFL. So I do think there's some hope for Sullivan in the middle of the line. As for Loadholt, they did bring in Andre Smith to provide competition, and they did re-sign Mike Harris to provide competition both at right guard and right tackle. So I don't think Loadholt will be pushed back if he's not ready, but I do think he's going to have some competition in camp. As for the line as a whole, I think the left side of the line is basically set with both Khalil and Boone, but hope is Sullivan would come back. Otherwise, Berger's kind of your emergency backup center, with Karen also being kind of the center who's been left in the wings the past few years. Right guard, you have good competition with both Fusco, who is coming back and was a very successful right guard, and Harris, who played well a year ago. But I do think right tackle is still a spot the Vikings could look to add some talent in the draft, especially if Khalil playing on his 1 year, fifth-year option, with there's some uncertainties whether he'll return after this season as well. So a young right tackle or offensive tackle who potentially could develop into a left tackle may be something the Vikings look into earlier than later in the draft.
Okay, and one of the things, obviously, it's the age-old question. It seems like for the past 6 years, somebody in Viking land, it'll be me tonight, ask, at what point in time do you look for the heir apparent for Adrian Peterson? He had another league-leading rushing year, but he's not getting any younger. Is it time for him to draft that person in the draft? And if so, who would the type of back the Vikings might look at?
Sure. I think that's more of a value-based question of who falls and when the value on the board really warrants taking a running back. The age-old question, and this will continue to come up time and time again, is when Adrian Peterson's time as a Viking will run out. I think next year things will really come to a head in the last year of his contract, forcing them to either go in a separate way or them to renegotiate once again to keep Peterson a Viking for the rest of his career. But I think Jerick McKinnon's role also kind of comes into play here as well. If you remember late last season, McKinnon played many snaps outside of the backfield, almost in more of a slot back role, and even played slot receiver at times. Mm-hmm. And if the Vikings want to keep that wrinkle in their offense, drafting another back who can run between the tackles is very important. Although Peterson was healthy this past year, if he were to be injured, then you're looking at McKinnon most likely taking the majority of the snaps out of the backfield, which would deplete that new wrinkle they added in the offense. So I think that's something that's a bit of a concern in my mind. Does that mean we should take a running back early? No, absolutely not. But when you start getting into the 4th, 5th rounds of a player such as C.J. Prosise out of Notre Dame, who's maybe more of a raw running back with some nice potential, drops to your spot, I do think it should be considered. Not that it would have to be done, but I think he's the one guy I would consider almost he would be the one guy I would consider earlier in the draft if he were to drop. Otherwise, more of a scat back, someone who's quick but can run between the tackles, like a Paul Perkins out of UCLA makes sense. And the further you go down the board, even someone like Kelvin Taylor, who's capable of taking snaps between the tackles, although he's unlikely to be the heir to Adrian Peterson.
But, Jeff, some of the Viking coaches catch our shows on VikFans.com, and I've even heard Mike Zimmer has dialed in a few times. So in case he's listening, and given he loves defense, let's turn to that side of the ball and start with something that's kind of unusual, and you probably know it, is we're starting to look like the Los Angeles Vikings here with about 10% of our roster coming from UCLA. And what I want to know, is there any chance that we add another Bruin in linebacker Myles Jack as the eventual replacement for Chad Greenway? I mean, Jeff, I know Jack seems to be falling in the first round because of that medical recheck of his knee.
Yeah, no, he has been. I mean, to the surprise of some, Jack seems to be falling down boards. At least if you read through your Twitter account, it seems like that's the case. I think in Jack's case, each team's going to have their own medical evaluation on him and how comfortable they feel with his knee. When you look in the top 5 picks, his talent definitely warrants a selection or at least consideration for those picks. But, GMs and front offices can't miss due to an injury on someone like Jack. And at least in those first 5 picks, So some teams may start taking him off the board there. But, I mean, he definitely is the type of linebacker that fits the modern-day NFL. He can do a bit of everything, and he's honestly, no pun intended, a jack of all trades. Mm-hmm. So some team after 5, I mean, even starting at the Jaguars could still consider him since he's that special of a player, but he'll get taken sometime, in that 5 to 15 range, really at the bottom of his draft floor.
Okay, well, and so the point is he's probably going to be gone before the Vikings are, but it leads to a question I've always wanted to know. And you hear, all the speculation of, you don't want to take this player because he's got an injury concern, so nobody in the top 15 is going to take him. But somebody from 16 to 32 might. So my question is, if he's a risk for a person in the first half of the round, why wouldn't the GMs from 16 to 32 be just as concerned because that's their first-round choice?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think so. Typically, front offices go through and they stack their draft boards, and they have something called a sub board. And I mean, any player that has a medical red flag or even personal conduct concerns are still ranked on draft boards. I mean, common fans tend to think that these players are completely dropped off the board. Well, I mean, some players who have very certain situations, maybe players like Jack who may be injured, although teams may not consider them in draft and place them on their actual draft board, they'll rank them on the sub board. And at some point, the value on that sub board becomes so great. As you say, you have a player who I would have ranked at, number 3 overall in the draft class, and now we roll around to the 15th pick. I mean, at some point, the risk starts to, or the reward starts to outweigh the risk per se. And if you can potentially get a game-changing player on your defense, which I mean, in Jack's case, he's a player who will be able to play this season. I think his injury concerns are more long-term, and wondering how long his career will be, where a GM will be like, well, we're in more of a win-now mode, or we're potentially going to be ready to win in the next 2 to 3 years or so. So someone like Jack would start making a lot of sense for their defense, regardless of how long his knee truly does hold up, if he has issues down the road at all.
We talk about injuries. Another linebacker who's fallen because of a knee injury in a bowl game is Jaylon Smith out of Notre Dame. Does he fit the Viking style, and do you think he's worth the risk in round 1?
In round 1, I think that's really up to debate. I mean, it's really hard to say without having medical evaluations or having that medical evaluation piece in front of you. But it's honestly a sad story of what happened to Jaylon Smith. I mean, it's very unfortunate that he suffered such a gruesome knee injury to such a special player. But for the Vikings, I think it's hard. It would be hard to invest a first-round pick in Jaylon Smith, although you may have the itch to, because you'd be getting some value if he comes back and is the same player he once was. It's hard to invest that pick in a third linebacker. I mean, the counter argument is that since he would be your third linebacker, you could make the pick. I mean, the Vikings have needs in other places where I don't really think the value makes sense in round 1. But once you start getting down further in the round, some potential playoff teams who have less holes on the roster, I mean, I think it does make some sense. But I think it's really hard for me to pin where Jaylon Smith will end up going, just because one team may be comfortable if his medical evaluation will, another may not. One may think that he'll come back at full strength, while another may be okay if his medical evaluation, but think he may be impacted and devalue him as well. So it's hard to pin his value. So first round is still possible. Albeit I believe it's probably unlikely. But I do think a second-day selection is very much still in the realm of possibility for Jaylon Smith.
Okay. And when you look at the defensive line, it's become a strength of the team. I mean, there's a lot there, not only the starting four, but the rotation of really 8. And we bought the young pass rusher, Daneel Hunter, in last year, and he did really well as a pass rush specialist. And I'm wondering, got the type of talent that can evolve into an every down player when Brian Robison retires, or do the Vikings need to look for somebody else for defensive line help earlier in the draft?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Daneel Hunter really was a nice surprise this past season. I mean, everyone knew going into last year's draft that he was a raw player that had all the measurables and athletic ability that teams look for in defensive ends. And all he needed was some consistent and good hard coaching in order to be successful in the league. And I think under Zimmer's toolage and the rest of the coaching staff here with the Vikings, I mean, he definitely flourished in his first year. With that said, I do believe believe he can be an every down pass rusher that can eventually be the heir to Brian Robison and also play in a rotation right now, as we kind of saw last season. But I think if we've seen Zimmer's defense and kind of was built in Cincinnati, regardless of how involved he was in building and drafting that defense, you can never have too many pass rushers. Mm-hmm. I mean, injuries always happen. I mean, and anytime you can pressure the quarterback, your entire defense is going to be much better and impactful. So although Hunter may eventually be the heir to Brian Robison, I mean, I don't think the Vikings would shy away from adding another defensive end, a developmental defensive end, most likely in the middle rounds, in order to kind of keep that rotation going. But kind of on the topic of pass rush, I think the interior defensive lines may be somewhere where the Vikings could look to upgrade in the second or third round to really kind of shore up that rotation at 3 technique, while also being able to stuff or run more consistently.
Anybody stick out in your mind as somebody you'd take a flyer on in the second or third round you think would fit the scheme well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think someone to keep your eye on is Javon Hargrave out of South Carolina State. He's more of a small school player, which the Vikings have not been opposed to drafting small school players in the past. Similar to Hunter, he's going to need some development once he reaches the league, and he's probably not someone you're going to want to rely on from day one. But he's the type of developmental player that you could plug in at your 3 technique, who both can rush the passer and stuff to run. I think of a big issue in my mind with the Vikings defense, I mean, their base defense, is at times Sharif Floyd can get washed out and run over. Sharif's a very talented player, and his quick step upfield can cause many problems. I mean, time and time again, but at times that can also hurt him when he over pursues a player and the running back can start getting downhill and onto the linebackers. Javon Hargrave would fix that a little bit. But more of a flexible piece in the mid rounds would be Sheldon Day out of Notre Dame. He's a really high motor player when you watch him on tape. Technically, he's quite sound, although he may not have the same upside as someone like Hargrave or some of the other first round prospects. He also can double as a defensive end at times, and that kind of versatility is really needed. I mean, on every NFL roster, you only have so many roster spots, so players who can play multiple positions are obviously valued very highly. So he's someone I could envision the Vikings looking into as well.
You know, you talk about it's passing league, and so the reality is you never have enough defensive backs. And last year, Rick Spielman nabbed Trey Waynes was the number 1 choice, and Waynes did struggle early to kind of avoid those interference penalties because he's so aggressive. Are the Vikings still high on him, or do they need to consider another full-time starter opposite of Xavier Rhodes?
I think the Vikings should and rightfully so, still be very high on Trey Waynes. I mean, in my mind, I still see Trey Waynes' upside as being the number 1 cornerback on this roster. I think with his size and speed combination, he definitely, with the right coaching and now starting this upcoming season with some consistent playing time, should hopefully develop into that number 1 cornerback he's capable of becoming. So I still think very highly of Waynes. The question mark in the secondary for Vikings really comes at the slot cornerback spot. As you look down the road, Captain Munnerlin's in the last year of his deal, and if the Vikings are going to give Smith a new contract this offseason, which should still happen sometime during or before training camp, they're going to have a lot of money tied up in the secondary once Xavier Rhodes' 5th-year option comes around. And I mean, if Trey Waynes develops, they're going to have to pay him as well. So Munnerlin may be the guy who does not return in the secondary, not to his own fault, but just from a money decision standpoint. So when we look at the draft, I think a slot cornerback really is more of a need than many people probably give it credit for.
Okay, but you don't see them doing a first-round cornerback. Do you see something maybe more middle rounds?
Yeah, no, definitely more of a middle round pick. I mean, there are some good cornerbacks in the first round, but slot cornerbacks can be found in the middle rounds. And I mean, I would expect the coaching staff to trust in their coaching, and I mean, be able to develop someone since they wouldn't have to be able to take over right now. But it's just protecting the potential for Munnerlin leaving, and then also having someone behind Munnerlin. After we saw Sherrills come in and play in the nickel defense once in a while, I mean, for a few snaps. I mean, not that he can't handle it, but he's not someone that you'd want on the field consistently.
No, Sherrills always gives you the impression is when you see him on defense, you realize how good a punt returner he is.
Exactly.
So and when you look on those special teams, the Viking fan base is just now recovering from watching kicker Briar Walsh miss that chip shot that would have been beaten the Seahawks to advance to the playoffs last year. And most fans, came out sympathetic to Walsh's miss, on a national stage and seemed to forgive him. But the last couple of years, the Vikings brought no one in to challenge him or even take reps off of him in training camp. And while I'm sure they won't spend a draft pick on a kicker, would you bring in competition for him? And how long will he suffer from those memories of that missed kick?
Well, I can't talk for Blair Walsh, so I don't know how long he'll suffer with those memories from those missed kicks. But I don't think the Vikings will bring in much competition at kicker. I mean, it really is Blair Walsh's job, and it has been his job the past 4 seasons now. And I mean, he's definitely had his ups and downs, but so does any kicker in the league. I mean, everyone's going to make their field goals. Everyone's going to miss a field goal they should have made as well. So, I mean, his just happened to be in a big moment, but I don't think it shows the type of kicker he truly can be. I mean, he definitely has the leg that many teams covet in their kickers. And at times when he gets on a roll, and I mean, when he seems to have it going on right in his head, and I mean, he thinks he can make field goals, he makes more in a row than a lot of kickers in the league.
And Jeff, one thing though, give me a punter. Give me any punter to challenge Jeff Locke. And the reason I'm asking that is, he's consistently the last in the league in gross and net punting average, and he seems to have a weak leg. And I know being left-footed, it was supposed to provide a different spin for returners and give him trouble. That hasn't seemed to happen. Do you bring somebody in finally to challenge him in camp? And if so, anybody out there in a free agent standpoint who's a rookie who you'd bring in?
Yeah, no, I think at this point it's probably worth bringing in competition for Locke. I mean, I think the way to describe Locke's career thus far as a Viking is inconsistent. At times, he really looks like he could be that kicker. I mean, he has a nice leg, but I think where he becomes inconsistent is pinning people within their own 20-yard line. At times he'll pin them within the 20-yard line 3 times in one game, and the next he can't do it once. And I mean, just not having that feel for the distance or a good feel for how the ball is going to come off your foot is somewhat concerning in my mind. I mean, overall, he has been a better indoor punter as we look at moving into U.S. Bank Stadium than he's been outdoors. But in the NFC North, I don't know if that would be a deciding factor for the Vikings or not. Looking at the punter class, I mean, I think they would definitely go the undrafted free agent route. And I mean, someone who's been on the Gophers and had success has been Peter Mortel. He was a senior this past year. And I mean, when you look at Mortel, he's a decent punter, but he's also a very good holder as well. So from an entire special teams perspective, since Locke is the holder on our special teams unit, being able to bring in someone who can both punt or at least compete with Locke in the punting game, but could also hold, since the Vikings wouldn't carry 2 punters, I think that would be mutually beneficial.
Okay, and this is the key question for you in the tournament. I want you to put the final touches on your draft analysis and go out on a limb. Who's the Vikings pick in round 1?
Hard to say. If Dachshund's there, I fully believe that he'll be the pick. I think he fits what the Vikings want, and the value also makes a lot of sense at number 23. If Dachshund isn't there, things get a little more wild, I guess I would say, and a trade down becomes a realistic opportunity. And then 2 players I would watch out for is if Seattle doesn't take Jermaine Ifedi, an offensive tackle out of Texas A&M. The Vikings are supposedly high on him. He's the type of athletic, developmental offensive tackle who could be the right tackle of the future, while also having the versatility to play offensive guard, which is something the Vikings always have valued. But someone else the Vikings could have interest in is safety Carl Joseph out of West Virginia. Although they brought in Michael Griffin this offseason, Carl Joseph is coming off an ACL injury and may not be ready week 1. So having that type of safety who can come in late in the season or even have more of a developmental year is someone you could plug next to Harrison Smith and feel like you're set for the next 4 years. Joseph is a special player, and I mean, unfortunately, he tore his ACL, but he's a surefire first-round pick and has the upside to be a very special safety in this league.
Well, we've seen a history of Rick Spielman trading up in the first round. He may take all 3 of them. Well,
you never know. Weirder things have happened in the NFL draft.
That's true. And, each year, Jeff, fans, they're always optimistic. They say this is the year for the Vikings. And with perhaps a draft filled with a starting receiver here or a linebacker, maybe a defensive back, and maybe some depth on the offensive line, Jeff, do you really see this Viking team as a serious contender to both repeat the NFC North crown, but also make a deep run in the playoffs?
I do. I truly do. I think the number one thing to look out for is not to judge the Vikings by their overall record. I think the goal is obviously to make the playoffs, and everyone's goal at the end of the season is to walk away with the Lombardi trophy. But when you look at the Vikings as a whole, I mean, although they're about to add another slew of draft picks to the roster, you have to remember the roster is still young in some areas. So just seeing development in those areas and seeing that next step forward is just as good as winning a division title. I mean, that's kind of a bittersweet answer. I mean, development versus winning a division title. But at the end of the day, getting into the playoffs is goal number one. And with a more complete roster, the Vikings definitely would be more of a threat in the playoffs to win multiple games, not just a wild card round matchup than they were this past season.
Well, that brings us to the end of the special draft preview show, and I want to thank Jeff Nichols for helping us break down the areas of need for the Vikings and for identifying some of the players the fans can keep their eyes on Thursday night when the draft unfolds in Chicago. Now, as we said earlier in the broadcast, I want to encourage fans to post your thoughts on this interview on VikeFans.com and on Twitter, and Jeff will provide responses to your questions and more details about some of the draft prospects. And that's all for tonight, and for Jeff Nichols, I'm Tom Moore. So long, everyone.